All right, everyone. So let's get into this very, very interesting subject on the origins of coronavirus. I want to talk about how the narrative, the mainstream narrative regarding COVID, is shaky. The mainstream narrative has been that COVID came from bats to humans. It came from nature, specifically bats, to human beings. This has been the mainstream consensus. Coronavirus broke out in Wuhan. The first cases were people who would go to this wet market in Wuhan. I believe these people were employees. And what a lot of people were saying last year was that people would go to this wet market to buy bat meat. They were buying bats for meat. And coronaviruses in the wild infect bats. So people were going to this wet market, they were buying bat meat, and they were getting infected. Well, it turns out that bats were not sold in this wet market. But it also turns out that the major Wuhan lab that specializes in coronaviruses was just 9 miles or so away from this wet market. Coronaviruses infect bats in the caves of Yunnan, not in Wuhan. So the virus breaks out, starts infecting people in Wuhan. And the mainstream narrative is that it goes from bats to humans. But the outbreak begins in a place where these bats don't live. These bats that are infected with coronavirus live in the caves of Yunnan, which is 1,500 kilometers away from Wuhan. So how could this pandemic start in Wuhan when the bats that are infected with these viruses live in Yunnan? Another thing also is that the flying range of these bats, the travel range that these bats have, is about 50 kilometers. Well, Wuhan is 1,500 kilometers away from Yunnan. So these bats couldn't just travel by themselves all the way from Yunnan to Wuhan. They were two Chinese researchers. Their names were Batao Xiao and Lei Xiao, who began to do an investigation on the origins of COVID when the coronavirus pandemic first began in China. So when COVID first began to be a problem in China, these two researchers began to investigate the origins of this virus. They scoped out the wet market, and they obviously recognized that it was very close to this laboratory in Wuhan, where they specialize on coronavirus. So these two researchers, they began to make some very interesting observations in this paper. The outbreak began in winter. It began in winter when these bats are hibernating. So how could these bats infect people in the winter in Wuhan, 1,500 kilometers away from their natural habitat, when they're sleeping, they're hibernating in the winter? So these two researchers, Batao Xiao and Lei Xiao, they concluded that coronavirus came from a lab. It leaked out from a lab and began to infect people. The scientist who really specialized on coronaviruses in China was Shi Zhangli. And she was a major scientist in China who was truly a specialist on coronaviruses. And she had been studying this stuff for a long time. Shi Zhangli was involved in a major science project to basically get involved in something that's called gain of function. Gain of function is just a nice little way of saying making viruses that kill people. That's what gain of function is. Shi Zhangli was involved in gain of function. She was involved in making these coronaviruses dangerous to humans. And she collaborated with an American scientist from North Carolina. His name was Ralph Baric. Ralph Baric was the one who taught Shi Zhengli this method of making viruses dangerous, of making the coronavirus dangerous. So it's not just the Chinese. A lot of people want to blame China. We should sue China. But there was an American scientist who was working with Shi Zhengli, Ralph Baric. And their project, their gain of function project, was funded by the NIH, the National Institute of Health. So they were getting American dollars. So the research to make wild coronaviruses that don't infect humans, that are not harmful to humans, but that infect bats, the research that was going into this was getting American dollars. And I hear people talking about suing China and all that, but this was getting bankrolled by the American greenback. This was getting bankrolled by the US government. Now, gain of function is obviously a very, very dangerous thing. I believe it was in the 1970s when scientists began to learn how to make dangerous viruses, to engineer viruses in a lab. In 2014, there was a moratorium or a ban on this type of research. And then in 2017, they began to lift the ban on gain-of-function research. And what they basically did was they found a loophole. And the loophole was that if this type of research can save lives, then go ahead and do it. This loophole was exploited by the director of the NIAID, or the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Anthony Fauci, and the director of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins. And so they wanted this research to continue. They wanted this research of making viruses dangerous to continue on. And in 2019, the U.S. government approved of a very sketchy and shady research project to make an extremely dangerous virus. This virus is called H5N1, and for now, and let's hope it stays that way. The virus is kept in a lab. It's H5N1, and if it ever leaked out, it would kill probably 1 billion or so people, because H5N1 has a death rate of 60%. They engineered this thing in a lab. They took a virus from the wild. I think it was a form of bird flu or swine flu. And they began to infect ferrets with this virus, and they had ferrets infect other ferrets, and they had those ferrets infect other ferrets, and they had those ferrets infect more ferrets, and eventually this virus went through so many adaptations, it went through so many different immune systems that it was able to become very, very dangerous, to the point that it has an extremely high death rate and also a very high rate of contagiousness. The scientists who were involved in this research were Ron Fouchier from the Netherlands and a Japanese scientist by the name of Yoshihiro Kawaoka. And these two scientists came up with this idea of making this very, very dangerous virus. I'm pretty sure there were other scientists involved as well, but these are the two faces on this project. And it was approved in 2019. So while we talk about coronavirus coming from a lab in Wuhan, let's not forget that in the United States, we have been involved in these sorts of very dangerous projects to the point where we have a virus that has a 60% death count. 60% death count. And if this thing ever got out of the lab, it would kill 1 billion people. Another thing that makes the mainstream story regarding the origins of COVID questionable is the fact that COVID doesn't have a high infection rate amongst bats. If COVID came directly from bats to humans, then it would still be able to infect bats. There was a team of scientists who actually experimented with this, and they wanted to see if COVID, not wild coronaviruses, but the COVID that we have been dealing with, can infect bats. The conclusion was that it has a poor infection rate amongst bats. It's not highly infectious when it comes to bats, but amongst humans, yes, very contagious. And that makes the whole mainstream narrative questionable. Because if it came directly from bats to humans, it would still be able to infect bats, but it doesn't. At least not at the rate that it does with humans. And it's interesting. Christian Anderson, major American scientist, sent an email to Fauci. And the email made the observation that there are aspects of coronavirus that indicate that it was potentially engineered. And they say that if you look at, for example, SARS, you can tell scientists can tell by observing the SARS virus that it went through multiple adaptations. They say that SARS came from bats, and then from bats it went to civets, which is kind of like a rat-like animal. And then from civets, it went through multiple adaptations before it was able to infect humans. So with SARS, we can conclude that it went through a natural adaptation to the point where it became dangerous. With coronavirus, it's not that emphatic. It goes from bats to humans. And the people who support the out of nature narrative say, well, it could have incubated amongst a human population before it became dangerous to humans. But they have yet to identify what this population was. Which human population was it that this virus was incubating in? They have yet to identify the population. What was the population that had COVID before the COVID outbreak began? They can't identify which population it was. They haven't been able to identify this population. When coronavirus first began to be a problem, there was a meeting that took place in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called Foggy Bottom. It's a very old neighborhood that goes all the way back to the 18th century. Present in this meeting were employees for the State Department. These people were essentially investigators. And also present in this conference was a guy by the name of Christopher Park. Christopher Park was the director of the State Department's biological policy staff in the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation. Christopher Park told these State Department employees, whatever you do, don't mention anything regarding America's role in gain-of-function research. Now remember, gain-of-function is just a fancy way of labeling the process of making viruses dangerous to humans. Christopher Park told these State Department investigators, these employees, don't say anything that could in any way connect America with this type of research. Why? If it was all just China, if it all just began in a wet market somewhere in Wuhan, then what's the issue? It's obvious that just as the Chinese have something to hide, the Americans also have something to hide in all of this. Because going back to Shi Zhengli and Ralph Baric, these two were involved in making coronaviruses dangerous to humans. And this project, this research, was funded by the US government. So it's not just the Chinese. The Americans also were involved in this type of research. Putting all this together, it's really not just a conspiracy. to talk about this. If you just mention any of this, you're automatically labeled as a conspiracy theorist. The former head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, he mentioned how COVID came from a lab. He's not working for the CDC anymore. But looking at all of this research, Vanity Fair just did an article, very long, in-depth article on the origins of COVID. Nicholas Wade last month wrote a very in-depth article on how the mainstream narrative regarding the origins of COVID is really quite questionable. So there's been a lot of research done on this topic. It's not just a conspiracy. So it's very, very fascinating. I'm currently working on an article on this. I'll put the links to the articles that I have been reading below so that you guys can read them for yourselves. And yeah, I hope you guys have learned something from this video. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.